One of the smallest islands in the South Pacific is causing some very big waves right now.
Nauru is a step closer to mining in international waters under highly contentious US legislation.
This kind of rogue mining, which it really would be, poses enormous risks to the deep seabed.
I want to remind these nation states that we all belong to the same ocean.
Kia ora, I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, how tiny Nauru is causing an uproar with its plans to explore and potentially mine a block of ocean for minerals and resources. The island nation could make millions out of it and provide employment opportunities for its people through its partnership with the Metals Company. It was drawn up in 2011. Nauru's president argues that the benefits of taking minerals to use them for batteries to increase electrification outweigh any environmental damage that might be caused.
The greatest risk we face is not the potential environmental impacts of mineral recovery, but the risk of inaction. There is a risk of failing to seize the opportunity to transform to renewable energy and to decarbonize our planet. We cannot let fear and misinformation hold us back.
But in surging forward, it's skirting around the international laws of the sea in spite of being a signatory to those laws.
Nauru, by entering into this agreement, has placed itself well outside international law.
But the rulebook on taking material from the seabed in international waters is still being written by the International Seabed Authority. That's work that's been going on for over a decade, and mining companies are getting impatient. This is the CEO of the Metals Company, Jared Barron.
If they overplay their hand, then it will be on their watch that lawlessness might come back to the high seas.
Thanks to the US president, they found another way around, without breaking any rules.
President Trump signing an executive order to fast-track deep-sea mining off the U.S. coast,
bypassing a global review process which is still under debate.
Quite honestly, it is the Metals Company wanting a quick return, and Nauru is left there really getting what they can.
I would suggest that Nauru is very much being driven by the interests of the Metals Company, which obviously is a commercial organisation. And whilst clearly there are good reasons for supporting Nauru's economic development and the welfare of Nauru people, I think there's an equally good argument that that should not come at the cost of potentially significant environmental harm, which may well affect all states, given that it's beyond national jurisdiction.
It's a complex issue. So today I'm talking to an expert in international maritime law, Professor Karen Scott. That's her you've just heard. And to RNZ Pacific journalist Tuila Fuatai, who's been breaking stories on the subject.
I've been covering deep-sea mining for a few years, and then Nauru is in the picture because it is one of the leading nations in the deep-sea mining industry.
How could that be? I mean, they are tiny. 21 square kilometres, 12,000 people? How do they have the capacity to set up a deep-sea mining operation?
So the capacity isn't so much with Nauru itself. You're right, Nauru is a tiny island, and it has a population of, 12,000 people.
It's pretty broke too, right?
Yes, so its main form of income would be it's got a refugee centre that is run with the Australians, so that gives it its government income. As well, it's part of the tuna fisheries industry, so there are fishing rights that it gets paid for its waters. And then it has a history of phosphate mining in its land. And when you look at the Nauru government site, it says it still earns money from phosphate mining or phosphate deposits, but that would be probably quite minimal.
Okay, that's historically, Nauru's been mined to bits for the sake of Australian and New Zealand farm fertiliser, right?
Yes, and the UK. So it's basically most of the land on this tiny island is unusable because it's been mined to bits, as you say, or it's been mined particularly in the 60s and 70s for phosphate that is used in fertiliser. Okay.
So how did they segue into looking at deep-sea mining?
So Nauru is one of, I think it's 19 nations that have been assigned a block of international waters through international oceans law so that's via the UN basically, in this area of the Pacific Ocean, which contains deep sea minerals.
So this is we're talking about the Clarion-Clipperton Zone?
Exactly, yes.
Okay. So they've drawn a line on a map and said this is yours to look after.
Pretty much. It comes under the UN Law of the Sea, and that piece of legislation is quite interesting because it has provisions in it which state that developing nations like Nauru should benefit from areas like that. So yes, lines in the ocean, but also it's not just Nauru, it's Tonga, Kiribati and the Cook Islands also have blocks in it. So there are other developing nations that have been recognised through that allocation of international waters.
And what are the others doing with their allocation?
These nations that have got those blocks are called sponsoring states.
Sponsoring states have certain responsibilities, which mean if they partner up with a contractor to work in the area, they must exercise what's called effective control. So that means things like checking the contractor is sticking to the terms of the contract, all the paperwork's in order, they must apply a precautionary approach and promote best environmental practice, respond to incidents and inquire into them, keep records, liaise with the ISA about what's going on, and monitor and inspect the activity in their area.
Not all sponsoring states have decided to go down the pathway that Nauru has, which is basically research for mining of these, they call them nodules, so they're little potato-sized rocks that sit on the seabed, and we're talking about this area that's in the middle of the Pacific, like it's between Hawaii and Mexico, like it's just in the middle of nowhere, and you can basically put sort of like Europe in the middle of it.
So it's thousands of kilometres away from Nauru.
It is thousands of kilometres away from Nauru, and it is in international waters. So it's under the jurisdiction, according to international oceans law, of the International Seabed Authority.
But I'm presuming Nauru itself doesn't have the economic wherewithal to go out and see what's there, right?
Yes, so this is where it's become quite interesting because Nauru and some of the other sponsoring states have partnered with deep sea mining and research companies to look at their blocks of this area and see what the mining potential is, essentially.
What would stop them doing that? Like, what are the rules over what they can do down there? Because, I mean, a lot of this is unexplored, right? We don't really know what actually is there in terms of sea life and, you know, potential undiscovered things. Yeah,
so you've brought in probably a big part of the missing research, I suppose, is we just don't know. There just isn't a lot of research on an area that is sort of 3 to 4 kilometres deep in the ocean.
And while these little metal rocks sit quietly on the ocean floor, the humans up on the surface are debating fiercely about what to do with them, who's entitled to them, who's allowed to make money off of them, what will happen to this ecosystem that we don't really know much about if we harvest these little balls.
Part of the work that's being done in that area is to look at what is going on down there. But it's pretty hard to know. It's like pitch black. We don't know what the sea life is down there. And it's being researched by mining companies or deep sea exploration companies because they're interested in these deep sea minerals or polymetallic nodules. So they're interested in bringing that up, and they've got to actually put forward a case, I suppose, as to whether that mining is financially viable and what the environmental impacts of that could be. So when you say we don't actually know what's down there, that's correct, because these polymetallic nodules and these deep sea minerals that they're sort of going to want to take off the surface, they've taken millions of years to form. So it's quite fascinating. They get formed by it's almost like a piece of sea debris, like dead bones or something. I don't know if a whale has died over millions of years. So that piece of debris sinks down to the bottom and then over millions of years accumulates different types of minerals, and that's how they think these polymetallic nodules have formed. So those have been millions of years in the making. So what happens when companies want to come and basically vacuum them up off the bottom of the seabed? What does that do to the sea life and the environment down there?
Which we don't know much about.
No, because we haven't had that much time to research it. So
So obviously, you can see where this is going. These companies are already in there doing the research, working out if it's financially viable. they're wanting to get cracking if they do find something done. And we're talking about sort of something that's pretty worthwhile, right? We're talking about all the things that we need to make batteries, essentially.
So that is probably where the research is still ongoing as well. And I think this is where companies like the Metals Company, which has partnered with Nauru to research its block of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone for mining potential, have become frustrated.
And I think people's patience are running out.
Do not dismiss the potential of deep-sea minerals outright. Do not ignore the science and the progress we have made. Instead, work with us to establish the robust regulations necessary for responsible mining.
Let's turn to the laws of the sea. Karen Scott is a Canterbury University expert who's been working in the area of international law of the sea for 25 years. She specifically researches ocean environmental issues and is the editor of the journal Ocean Development and International Law.
The law of the sea has been codified in a treaty, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this was adopted in 1982. It's a global treaty. It's been ratified by 169 states as well as the European Union. And what the Law of the Sea Treaty does, we tend to refer to it as UNCLOS, it sets out the various maritime zones, and it also articulates what rights and duties states are able to exercise within those zones. So there are two broad maritime zones sort of beyond the jurisdiction of states, sort of in international waters, if you like. First, the high seas. And within the high seas, no state is able to exercise sovereignty, but all states are able to exercise key rights, such as the freedom of navigation or the freedom of fishing. The deep sea bed, which is the seabed under the high seas beyond national jurisdiction, is subject to a very particular regime under UNCLOS. And UNCLOS designated both the seabed and its mineral resources as the common heritage of humankind. And this was actually the first regime of its nature. No state can take minerals from the area outside of this international regime. And there are complex but as yet incomplete rules around how the mineral resources can be extracted and how the benefits of those resources should be shared.
This is the United Nations generated thing, right? The Law of the Sea.
Yes, the convention essentially is adopted under the auspices of the United Nations. That's
Right.
correct.
So of the nations who've signed up, I guess there's one big fly in the ointment. Who hasn't?
Well, the most significant nation, which is not a party to the treaty, is the United States. The extent to which the United States is bound by the Law of the Sea, however, is not quite as clear-cut, because it's generally agreed that the Law of the Sea Convention is now part of customary international law. So that means it binds all states, even those states which have not signed up to the treaty. The United States accepts most of the Law of the Sea, but it has had a long-standing objection to Part 11 of UNCLOS, which establishes the regime for the deep sea bed. So there is a question as to whether it is bound by virtue of custom to the deep sea bed regime. It has objected on the one hand. On the other hand, it has operated constructively with the International Seabed Authority over the course of a good many years. It has never authorised mining to this point beyond its jurisdiction and has not otherwise operated in a way contrary to the International Seabed Authority regime. So some would argue that the US is effectively bound by the regime by virtue of custom. The US does not.
Right. Okay. So up till now, it's basically been going along with the rules of the majority, but sort of reserved its rights to put a spanner in the works.
That's right. Yes, it certainly never accepted the regime, and it has voiced its objections on a regular basis.
Okay. So what's the United States' role then in Nauru's efforts to take part in deep sea mining?
The way the United States has got involved is that in April of this year, President Trump issued an executive order whereby it essentially endorsed a legislation which was previously adopted in 1980, the Deep Seabed Hard Minerals Resources Act. And as part of that act, there's provision in that act which allows the US to authorise mining beyond its jurisdiction. Now, that legislation was actually adopted 2 years prior to the finalisation of the negotiations of UNCLOS. It has never been used at this point to authorise mining beyond the US jurisdiction. But President Trump has indicated that legislation should be used in this respect. And the metals company, which is the company which is sponsored by Nauru, has indicated that they are going to apply for mining authorization under the US Act, as opposed to going through the International Seabed Authority. It's not absolutely clear whether they are intending to do so in relation to mining in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is sponsored by Nauru. If they were to do so, Nauru would undoubtedly be in breach of international law, since it's a party to UNCLOS and therefore may only mine through the UNCLOS regime.
So what's the penalty if Nauru goes ahead with sponsoring the metals company to mine the seabed?
This situation, where you have a state which appears to be operating outside of the International Seabed Authority, is more challenging to address. The International Seabed Authority itself doesn't have any means of stopping a state from mining. It could potentially issue legal proceedings against a party to UNCLOS, so that would be Nauru, not the United States, before the Seabed Disputes Tribunal of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. Possibly the tribunal could issue provisional measures, which is a little bit like a domestic injunction against Nauru. But again, it's not really able to actually enforce that judgment. Under international law, it's more common for states to actually act unilaterally or collectively against other states that are in breach of international law. So we've seen that in connection with Russia, for example, where a number of states, including New Zealand, have issued sanctions against Russia in response to their invasion of Ukraine. So UNCLOS parties could take action, direct action, essentially punishing either Nauru or the US, assuming the US is in breach of international law. So these might include things like trade sanctions or suspending aid, diplomatic relations, restricting Nauru or US registered ships from entering their ports. But these measures are not always effective. And of course, the decision to take them is often very much political.
Tuila says the metals company has spent a lot of money and time investigating Nauru's allocated block in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone.
And this is where the company's frustrations have come from. It partnered with Nauru first in 2011, and that partnership came through the ISA framework. So what are we now, 2025? So that's over a decade, well over a decade. We're at 14, 15 years that it has been looking at this block for its mining potential. And during that time, it's funded through shareholders. So has its own financial responsibilities. And the ISA has been trying to make rules around deep sea mining, and that includes stuff like how much can you take, what determines whether it's a viable amount, sort of some not restrictions, but just rules basically around what's okay to do and what's not okay to do.
And they're still doing this?
They are still doing it. So
okay.
That started in 2014 and it's ongoing. They're in a huge meeting right now, still working through all these rules and trying to get a draft agreement. So not even a final agreement, just draft rules.
Meanwhile, 37 nations so far, including New Zealand, have called for a moratorium on deep-sea mining.
The government's position is that mining should not commence until the International Seabed Authority creates a strong legal framework backed by science that will ensure environmental protection for the marine environment. Greenpeace Aotearoa is calling this change from a previously neutral stance a win for the ocean and people power and a vital step to protecting the ocean.
This might seem hypocritical since an application to do exactly that off the Taranaki coast has been put on the fast-track list by this government. But the rules basically say what nations do domestically in their own waters is none of anyone else's business.
So commercial mining hasn't really occurred for deep-sea mining, as in vast amounts of minerals being pulled up from the seabed, or polymetallic nodules, We've seen other types of sea mining, like dredging, occur in other places, but this is kind of an untested industry. So
because it's at the bottom of the ocean.
Yes, and mining has largely occurred on land. for these minerals.
Yeah, and this is what I think the metals company is basically saying, that large tracts of lush jungle in places like Indonesia are being dug up to find the same minerals. And they're saying, well, wouldn't we be better off trading a few sea worms for the same purpose?
And that's where the jury's still out. So the research, because these, again, it goes back to the fact that these minerals have been down there for millions of years, to remove them and disrupt the ocean in that way, there's just not enough research yet to show what the long-term impacts of that, and the more research that seems to be done shows it probably isn't good. But it's very early days, and that probably goes back to why this organisation, the International Seabed Authority, are still taking their time in forming these rules, because how do you form rules when you don't have the baseline foundation?
The information and the data. Yeah. When you say probably not good, what do you mean by that?
Well, for example, the technique that they want to use from everything that's come out is that they'll be sort of vacuuming these little potato-sized rocks off the seabed to remove them. So they vacuum them up. On these actual nodules, what they do know is that they've all got sort of their own ecosystem around them. So little creatures down there might use them, to land on or to live around. They might collect food from around there. There's just not a lot of information. So whatever you do when you remove them, you disrupt what goes on down there. And then the other part of that is for the processing, they'll vacuum them up and then take what they need, and then the sediment and whatever else comes up, because it's not like you can just pick up the individual nodule, especially if you're doing it en masse. You're going to be vacuuming them up probably a lot more than just one or two things. You release whatever, all the other rubbish that isn't needed back into the ocean. And so that again disrupts, it's sort of like they're calling it like a plume that comes out of the processing boat.
Right.
So you're just going into parts of the ocean that there isn't a lot of information on yet.
But Nauru doesn't see things that way.
Mr. President, Nauru's story is not one of despair, but of resilience. Our people have thrived for centuries, living in harmony with the land and the sea. Today we adapt, we innovate, and we persevere. We are exploring new frontiers because even as we fight against the effects of climate change, we must also adapt to the reality that is upon us.
What we see with Nauru is this is a country that wants to secure an income, and a lot of the nations in the Pacific region do need that. New Zealand sits here as a wealthy nation in the region, but the likes of Nauru, the Cook Islands, and Tonga is another one that has deep sea mining rights in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. They're all looking for ways to get some income and improve the lives of their people.
You can't blame them for that, though, can you?
No, not at all. I suppose the flip side of that is, yes, but what are we actually doing to the ocean and to where we live? Don't forget that Nauru, we've already alluded to it, is a tiny place. We're all small island nations, and they call us big ocean states because we're sort of at the whims of the ocean. So if you're going in and extracting, what is that doing to the climate and the fact that we're dealing with more and more natural disasters? That's where that unknown sort of piece of research comes in around long-term impacts.
And because we don't know what else is deep down in the ocean, Karen Scott says there's an important principle of law here designed to guide decision-making in such situations.
So the precautionary principle, which is a general principle of international law, it's absolutely a principle of the law of the sea, and it specifically applies in the context of the area regime, says that you need to be cautious where your activity may risk environmental harm and when you have scientific uncertainty. And that is absolutely the situation here. So that's why those 37 states and indeed many NGOs and a number of companies are arguing that we actually need to pause this idea of mining until we know much more about what is down there and what the implications might be.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Rangi Poick. Thanks to Karen Scott and Tuila Fuatai. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite anō.